Well, hello, and welcome to the stream. Let's go ahead and see what we can get into. We're going to do a little Art Bell with Dr. Michael Heisner, Ufos, and E.T.S. Hey, Torres.
I'm Art Bell 51 on Twitter. And don't forget about the wormhole. You can wormhole me just like Bill has done here. Bill says, hi, Art. Wanted to voice my opinion on Hoagland and his anomalies on Mars. I bought into, literally, the phase on Mars. But not another one of these finds. Note that his number 9 photo looks like all the rocks around it. Bill, really, that's a wormhole message. You know, you bought into the phase on Mars and some other stuff, I guess. But you can't buy into number 9? Oh, Bill. Since when does the good Lord on Mars or Earth put a pipe in the middle of a rock? Even if you consider gravity is like a pipe. Look real hard, Bill. There's a pipe there, sticking out horizontally. It's kind of hard to ignore. By the way, Richard will be here for an hour tomorrow night. He'll be talking about Comet Ison, which has turned green as it nears Mars. For some reason, instead of having a red influence, you would think by Mars, right? It's turned green. We'll find out what that means tomorrow night, along with a lot of other stuff about comets. Now, SiriusXM is looking really hard into the possibility of a 4-hour timeout being worked on. So if you're listening to the stream, you won't, disconnect you after 90 minutes. Roswell's Art, I'm so glad the show is back. This is enough. My 11th grade Spanish teacher turned me on to the show back in 2001. Anyway, to address the inactivity timeout that everybody's having problems with, the listeners must click something within the player interface. Big tip. Not just move their mouse around the screen. The easiest way and least disruptive is just double-click the pause button during a commercial break. Who cares if you listen to our commercials, right? Glad the show is back and so forth and so on. Remember, if you want to say welcome back, folks, Roswell's are the way to say it instead of saying it. So we're working on this 4-hour timeout thing, and we might get it 4 hours. It'd be really cool. If you didn't, because I was not here last Thursday, we got this really cool thing I wanted to tell about last Thursday regarding Scotty's tower. He moved that through a house, and we had the photographs of it up. Well, what Scotty did was he made a video. It's from like a video slideshow, and it's really, really cool. You should go to artbill.com and take a look at it. It's hilarious. Absolutely hilarious. Artbill.com, Scotty's video. I'll have to dig for it a little bit. Now, I think we're just going to call it, everybody's asking about this, everybody. We're going to call it Dark Matter Halloween. And we are going to do nothing but ghost stories. Now, I have a couple of ideas about this, and we do it every year. We're going to do it this year. What I want you to do, if you can, is, of course, we're going to take open lines, on-screen open lines. I think. Oh, wait a minute, maybe we will screen a little bit. You should have a ghost story. But if you want to email me, you can do so. And if you're going to email me and have a really good ghost story, include your phone number, and we will call you. So that's a way to get some really good ones in. So if you've got one, email me, artbell@artbell.com, include your phone number, and Dark Matter Halloween. Your phone may ring, and it may be us. Well, I checked about, 15 minutes ago, turned on CNN briefly. The countdown clock was still going. Are we launching to Mars? No. We're counting down to the close of the government. Again. It's interesting. I've noticed that Congress now has a 10% approval rating, higher actually than Satan himself. Oh, by the way, if they do close the government, it's so sad, isn't it, that agencies like the IRS will close. But wait, they won't. IRS, even our state parks are gone. Trying to apply for a passport, forget it. But the IRS will stay open. Essential to national security? Oh, boy. It's been said that when you're one step ahead of the crowd, you're a genius. When you're 2 steps ahead, you're a crackpot. All right, looking around the world very briefly, inspectors charged with the enormous task of overseeing the destruction of Syria's deadly chemical weapons stockpiles kicked off their mission Monday, racing to meet tight deadlines against the backdrop of civil war and probably also racing to catch up with the people who trying to move the weapons around, I would think. Syria says it is fighting rebels who eat human hearts. Serious about this. Syria's foreign minister claimed Monday that his government is fighting a war against Al-Qaeda-linked militants who eat human hearts and dismember people while they're still alive, then send their limbs to family members. I thought that was an Russian treat. Nearly 3 dozen migrants marched across the U.S.-Mexico border without papers on Monday. The latest group of the younger generation brought to the U.S. illegally as children seeks to confront head-on immigration policies they consider unjust. Well, good luck with the government doing anything about that or anything else, including even continuing past midnight Eastern. Now, listen, I've got, just in case there is a last-moment resurrection, and the government is going to stay open in case they vote the right way, be sure and wormhole me right away, please. Just doesn't matter how you say it. Send me a wormhole message if they suddenly keep the government open, all right? This is a very, very interesting story. Credit to the anomalous. Authentic alien images from Roswell finally found. Is that alien question mark? Yes, the UFO iconoclast. These images exist as Kodachrome slides, and Anthony Galia, lead of the Roswell Dream Team, hopes to set their head straight on the truth and what's a lie surrounding the leaked stories in the past week. There have been rumors everywhere of real Roswell photographs hanging as of. Anthony says they're not going to release them to the general public since the owners are put off by some unprofessional ufologists. Is it a show game to maintain interest in Roswell by teasing us? Or are the slide's owners genuinely creeped out by the unwanted invasion of their privacy? Well, I know from the latter. This is fireball time, folks. I mean serious fireball time. A huge fireball explosion created a power outage and a lot more in Yucatan, Mexico. That was Sunday evening last night. A weird sky phenomenon broke up the monotony of small Maya town as a huge object thought to be a fireball. And you can tell me what it is because you're going to be able to see it. It lit up the skies over the town. The people in the southern Yucatan around 8:30 p.m. local time, falling object was accompanied by a strong thundering noise, while a blast going to hit the ground. And it did hit the ground. Now, the crash, the word used here, was followed by flashing blue hazes, if you can imagine that, flashing blue hazes, and power outage. The flames were observable until about 2 a.m. at the object's landing site. See what he used the word landing there. The sky phenomenon was also observed in several other Mexican townships. What was it? I don't know. As you can imagine, people got totally freaked out by all this, and they found stuff. Now, you can see this thing, or these things. I'll leave it up to you. You take a look up, Torres without photographs. Something pretty good size crashed in Yucatan. If you go to artbill.com, you can take a look-see at it. Now, the police there were toying some of the debris of whatever the hell this was. By the way, maybe one of those arrangements for me, I have no idea what this thing is like over 9. Not really. You get the idea, right? Pretty big. Whatever it was, it came down, it was pretty darn big space for me, maybe. And the police were playing around with some of the debris. There is the picture of a human-like figure made of the debris. I wonder if the police did that, or it came that way. I don't know. Other fireballs, I'll tell you more about kind of time there. Other fireballs in Ohio. So it's like one fireball city here, folks. I mean, lots and lots of fireballs. I'm not sure what's going on. Keep your eye on the sky, huh? All right, well, I'm not going to take you over at Mike Heiser's house. He is our guest tonight, Mike Heiser. Some of the things Mike Heiser talks about down in the Mike Heiser is a scholar in the fields of biblical studies and the ancient Near East. He is currently the academic editor for Logos Bible Software in Washington, and serves as an adjunct professor at 3 colleges and universities. Mike has a PhD in ancient Semitic languages, along with 2 master's degrees in biblical studies and ancient history. In 2005, he was named one of Fate magazine's 100 most influential people in mythology. You should see this list. Mike is a well-known critic of ancient astronomical beliefs and for having majestic documents tested by a computational linguist for authenticity. He is also known for his supernatural thriller, The Sun, which focuses on how an ET disclosure might impact traditional religious beliefs. So we're going to have fun with that tonight, and how the alien question might be related to ancient texts, including, of course, the Bible. Mike, welcome to Dark Matter.
Well, thanks for having me on. I just have to say, listening to you read the news is like listening to Vin Scully call a baseball game. Really, it's just, oh yeah. I mean, I'm going to take a breath. I don't want to sound like too much of a fanboy, but I'm just thrilled that you're back in the air. I don't know how you waited this long. I think back, because it sounds like you just love it.
That's from a long time.
Oh man, I would have just been pulling my hair out.
What do I know that?
Great to hear you.
Thank you. I've never received a compliment for this working on wheels. I thought that
I have hackers too, your introduction.
What part really got you? The eating of the hearts? Was it?
No, it's just rhythmic. It's just taking simple headlines. It's heartfelt reading the news. You can just sort of sit there and listen to it for hours. It's just great memories for me. But I listened to you for years while I was in grad school, all by myself. I'm holed up as a security guard in my little shack. The genetics lab, I had to guard. I'm listening to Heartfelt.
I'm really not in like the very best way, but
well, I'm a little, next number of years removed, as you are, but it's just great to hear you again.
All right, but listen to this one. I can also write back to us. This is way back. I'm so glad you're back from Sirius XM. Discovered the show about 15 years ago on a regular radio. Well, that's it. How much? Like this, folks. I have a little over a show on the outlet of Okinawa when I was a 9-year-old kid and moved to Alpha. My dad was a pilot of Vietnam. We were stationed on the rock. And you introduced me to the rock and roll music, became such a big part of my life. You were the first DJ I remember, and I had my little transistor radio and I listened to that sort of little piece. Yeah, they referred to something I did when I was on a keyboard player. Contest with the Wolverines. I had a Navy guys partner, and they went to those Wolverines. And we went for 57 hours, something like that. Anyway, he ends the email. Remember now, he first heard me when he was 9 years old. I'm 56 now, Art. And what was that expression? Hey, short, all right, we're my old time guy. 56 years old now, and this person first heard me when I was 9. It's right, what you said is right down that alley. Well, it's not quite that far, but it's pretty impressive. All right, let's get started. I want to talk about ecology. Did you hear the first story that I read about the Roswell? Have you heard these rumors? Oh yeah, I've heard them, and I've read the show. I'll be charitable here. The conflicting accounts of the story of the photos surfacing. And boy, this is just it's gonna be a big fight. I mean, it's already been a big fight, but it's gonna be a big fight. What would you say, Mike? This is just a sort of a what if, but if they released these Roswell photographs, they were authenticated, and it was proven that we were visited by these creatures that, those probably were at Area 51 for a while or disposed of in some manner or are still alive, whatever. In other words, real creatures. If it's proven, what would you say? Well, I would say I'm not terribly surprised. Personally, I don't have any. Yeah, I don't really have any difficulty, theologically or religiously. But on the heels of that, that's me talking. I mean, I can say, well, I'm not real surprised, that. Given this or that, it's not really too much of a stretch. I mean, I look at it as an academic. I know that this question has been around literally, for 2,000 years. It goes all the way back to Aristotle, before this pre-Christian, are there other worlds? I mean, everybody's been talking about this for millennia. It's only really been recently that it's just become this scary thing, for religious people. So I would try to get people to pay attention to the conversation that's been happening for so long and say, look, this is a big deal because it is, now we have, evidence of this. But as far as the discussion, I mean, this sort of just falls right into place. Then the questions change, they become different. It's not, are we alone or not? Then it's like, well, what does this mean? Where they come from? Are there others? And all this sort of thing. I'd like to live, in the Star Trek world, where there's life, elsewhere and so on and so forth. I mean, I'm known for just asking what I think are reasonable questions about evidence and things like that. But if we ever had it, I wouldn't be unenthusiastic about it at all. But that's me. I don't think that in this era of discovering suddenly hundreds and hundreds of exoplanets, planets that are like Earth that can conceivably support life. That's a major discovery, you've got to admit, in terms of the probability of life being discovered. Yeah, I think those kind of finds are better than something like the Drake equation. I tend to be in the crowd that has a fairly low view of the Drake equation because I don't know. Explain for everybody the Drake equation, please. Well, this is Frank Drake, the astronomer, came up with a famous equation that tried to articulate the probability of life existing elsewhere. And
And that's a worthy thing to attempt. The problem with the Drake equation is that every point of the equation was made up. In other words, there wasn't any data for it. Now, that's why I say this kind of thing. We actually are starting to get data. There's X number of planets now that, to the best of our scientific ability, will support life. That starts to fill in some of those gaps. And so when I think probability, if someone's talking to me about the Drake equation, it's like whatever. But if they're talking about discoveries like this, to me that helps.
The last 100 years of the discovery of these exoplanets changes the equation.
Well, if you're making a pun there, yes. I would say, it changes the conversation in this way. I think this conversation on probability actually becomes more data driven than a sort of a contrived equation. I don't want to say contrived there in a negative sort of way, but because I think it's worth trying to speculate, but without data, that's what you've got. You've got speculation. I think it's a reasonable conclusion. If it becomes a more reasonable conclusion, let's put it that way, if we have, evidence of there are other places that, again, life as we know it could be sustained. It doesn't prove anything, but it does make the probability reasonable. And for me, it gets it on the table. If we didn't have any sort of planet other than Earth that we can talk about in these terms, and then we're going to have this probability discussion. Without that, to me, it doesn't even really deserve to get on the table. Now that you have
we're just looking at that little dots of light and saying, well, it would be a great waste of space and form if there weren't.
That's an emotional argument, but I'd rather have data than, I don't want to sound cold here, but I'd rather have data than the emotional argument.
All right. Well, we're beginning to get that data, and with those science, first of all, I have somebody from City, ancestral staff from City, and they haven't heard anything yet, right? But it occurs to me that if there's all these exoplanets that are like Earth, capable of sustaining life, why do we suppose that life would evolve? Well, the way we have technologically, and even have radioactivity, or even imagine it.
I think that's a reasonable question to ask. I've wondered that myself, and you and I aren't alone there. I mean, there are criticisms of SETI in that regard, that why aren't you using a different strategy to look for this or that? So, the truth is, the blunt truth is, we don't really have any reason to make that assumption that they would be communicating the same way. But the reality is, that's what's within our reach. It's a funding issue, it's a technology issue. It's a garnering of interest. To get people to care issue. All those things are part of the discussion.
You would describe yourself how? As a skeptic?
I would describe myself as someone who, again, would like these things to be true, but I want there to be real evidence for it. I'm not impressed with anecdotes. I'm not impressed with emotional arguments. I just like to know, and when I say I believe or think X, I'd like to have something concrete to sort of base that on, to fall back on. So with some people, that makes me a skeptic. With other people, especially in the more fundamentalistic wing of Christianity, what I've already said tonight is just awful, because there's this tendency to equate the whole question of extraterrestrial life with one of two things, and probably both. And that is the demonic realm, and then we must go by into Darwinian evolution. And I'll confess, I'm not really disturbed by evolution. I don't really like materialistic Darwinism, but that's not the same as the idea of evolution.
Are you convinced of evolution, though?
Yeah, I think evolution is a reality. The question in my mind, there are questions in my mind like to what extent, what mechanisms did it need? I'm sort of at an advantage here, because when I was in graduate school, the place where I went to church was heavily populated by professors from the hard sciences at the university there, the University of Wisconsin. We had the head of environmental studies, we had the head of botany, we had 2 research physicists, we had a geologist, we had a professor of electrical engineering, we had another one in chemistry. I mean, people like me in the humanities were like completely outnumbered. And all of them were very serious, about their faith, their theological commitments, and every one of them accepted the idea that evolution, God did it. No kidding, it's a no-brainer. They just didn't flinch about it. It was not. Trying to start a conversation with them. Well, what do you think about people who might be here, even in our church, or some colleague you have somewhere, or some acquaintance that don't agree? And to that, it wasn't even a sensible question to ask. But yet they were very serious. Well, I spent 9 years in that environment. And so I just have to chuckle, when I read things or hear things about how this is sort of an all or nothing proposition, or we either have to accept this or that in the Bible or evolution. There's no in between it. It's like, I just know better. I know intellectually better because I read lots of stuff. I know by experience as well that these are not mutually exclusive things. And so I'm not a scientist. I have to depend on scientists to sift arguments for me. I read things that I appreciate, on evolution. I read, there's a lot of debate within hard sciences about evolution. Evolution is
right. And it easily said, that, God may have started the process of evolution. And that sort of cleans it all up right there.
Yeah, and that's where most of these guys were. I mean, I think there may have been 1 or 2 that would be willing to say it was sort of random. In other words, when you take that position that you just articulated, that God started the process, that involves a deliberate decision. You're speaking of God as a person, you're not with making intelligent decisions and whatnot. And that's the common view for people who are in the sciences who happen to be Christians who would accept evolution. There might have been 1 or 2 of these people that I knew that would have taken a step back even from that and made it a little more random, closer to what you would think of as a secular Darwin position. They were somewhere in between there. But I agree with you. I think that idea, and then the sub-question is, tell me why God couldn't make that decision. Right, exactly. On what basis would you say that God is limited and kept from making that decision? And to me, that kills the conversation. But again, that's me. So I'm not troubled by the idea that if there is this thing, this force of nature, and in God's hand, some providential thing that we call evolution, maybe life evolved somewhere else, and then the discussion changes to, well, would God have a purpose in that? What would the point be? What's the relationship between that and us? You get a whole number of layers of other questions, but I don't think the discussion needs to stop with the first question, about probability.
Something could have evolved from stardust. I mean, it's stardust, mud puddles, lightning strikes, you name it, right?
Yeah, I mean, that is an issue, because if I were to say that again to one of my friends, Professor so and so, he would say whatever. But someone who's sort of been trained to think that, well, the reason, Mark Bell is suggesting that, and the reason someone is saying that is because they want me to accept the idea that, I'm an extraterrestrial, or extraterrestrials are our space brothers. And in other words, because they've sort of conditioned to respond a certain way, they, unfortunately will. They won't really stop to think, well, there's 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 different ways to sort of look at this, and they'll kind of gravitate to the one they really dislike, and then, it becomes a real thing to fight over.
All right. So with word extraterrestrials, married to the idea. Nor are you that distant from the can't embrace possibility.
I like I said, I have this romantic spasm in me that, boy, wouldn't it be nice if Star Trek were real? Minus the Klingons and the Romulans, I guess. But that would be really interesting. It'd be fascinating. It's sort of on my short list of, boy, wouldn't I like to see this before I die, that kind of thing. But on the other side, well, I have things like let's clone a mammoth and all that kind of stuff. There are just some things I'd love to see them do. And again, this is on the list, so I'd like to know. But on the other side, I don't think we really have evidence yet. A lot of what people accept as evidence, I just don't think is really good evidence. And so I sort of suspend it and hope. But because I hope one direction doesn't mean I'm going to embrace what I think is a really bad argument.
Or some people who would ask you to accept the evidence, I should say, proponents of the evidence. When you look back at all the UFO sightings, when you look at all the stories, they claim it all adds up to it's got to be true.
Yeah, they do claim that, and that's the part I have difficulty with. I don't think it adds up to that at all. Ask yourself this question: why do we, with the whole UFO thing, why do we think about UFOs and think extraterrestrial? What do you think most people?
In my case, Mike, I had a sighting. A very close sighting, a very convincing sighting. I could have heard a rocket doing thing. It floated over my head, or more likely defied gravity, and then I watched it float out across the valley. At the time, and once you've seen something like that, then yes, you can ask questions like the ones you were just looking.
Right. Now, if I saw, you were referring to the triangle. I remember you just talking about that on the air at length. If I saw one of those, my first thought would be either let's get in the house or boy, that's really cool. But I've read this sort of technology, especially the slow moving ones, is really on the board, on in patents. I actually blog about this stuff with some frequency. Back in the 20s and 30s, in other words, you could have seen a dirigible or a dirigible married to nuclear power. It's harder to talk dirigible when they make, when they go real fast and make turns and all this sort of thing. What I'm getting to is you think extraterrestrial because it's an unfamiliar technology, and it seems like the technology is something that, because we haven't experienced, the assumption is that it's not ours and that we couldn't do it. I've actually become more convinced that the technology is a dead end. Again, the Germans were making triangular craft in the 40s. They had passed, all the test, testing. They had nuclear power as a whole. But
It's a dead end. Explain that, please.
I don't think it's a question to ask. In other words, I don't think it's the thing that will tilt the question one way or the other. To me, the tougher issue is biologicals, okay, or the claims of bodies and whatnot. So for me, that's what I would have to have. I would have to have, let's say that, we have these pictures or there's some other, real clear biological evidence. Okay, well, that answers question one. Question two is actually a little different, and that involves visitations and then individual sightings. And then you sort of have to go from point one to these other points. But for me, the fundamental question of, are there extraterrestrials, intelligent extraterrestrials out there? I would need a biological entity because there's so much that you can look at and dig out, and people have just devoted their life to tracing these exotic technologies. So even the majestic documents, there are majestic documents that actually have the elements in the quote-unquote power plant of the craft that you can find were used in technology during World War II to produce nuclear power without a reactor. I mean, they all have the elements.
I'm going to have to interrupt you there, Mike. Hold tight, please. We're going to do a break. I would like Mike, the majestic documents, these were quoted almost biblically for years and years and years and years by so many people. And I guess you finally had a good hard look and went out and got them tested. Can you describe how you did that and the results?
Sure. And for listeners, if you go to my website, which is just drmsh.com, At the top, there's a link that says Quick Links, and if they go to that page, they'll be able to download the study we did for free. One of the links there, I'll just sort of overview it. What we did, and I say we because I had known of someone named Dr. Carol Chasky who did this for a living. She is a computational linguist. She did her doctoral work at Brown University, actually came up with her own program as part of her dissertation to test something called authorship attribution. And she has made a career in court cases when someone needs to either verify or rule out that a document was written by the person that, say, signed that letter or claimed authorship, to be able to test that. And so she has had a long career. Her work has been featured in numerous court cases. If you look her up on the web, she has a whole list of that. So I found out about her. I thought, well, this is the ideal person to test some of these documents if she was interested. And I was like, how do I do that? And it is this. What she focuses on would not be common vocabulary, but would be what we call in grammar function words. Little words like conjunctions, prepositions, interjections. In other words, the words that you don't really think about, but you just sort of visually use in certain ways. Like everybody sort of develops these unconscious patterns. And so she actually focuses on the uncommon in terms of, non-specialized vocabulary. But another way to look at it is the most common words that everybody uses. So when you go through a document, again, her procedure, this is what you're looking for. The whole idea is to establish patterns. Now, it's only the methods we use only apply to documents in the majestic group that had authorship attribution. In other words, a particular document that supposedly was sent by, Roosevelt or Tillicott or somebody like that, General Twain. So we had to pull those out, and then we need to prevent stuff more than one or two sentences, because some of these are just memos that, just one sentence. And so we had to have at least a paragraph. So we went on that, and then we put the zero in on the documents. This was really a funding issue because I was paying which are the ones that have the most content that is the most explosive, and which are the ones that talk about extraterrestrial, bodies or something that really, has an important role to play potentially in the whole narrative. And so we got a hold of those. So when you do that, you have your documents that you want to test the attribution. So what I had to do, and I listed the help a couple of people to find, okay, we're going to test two documents here that were written by General Twain. Well, let's go to our archive website and we try to find documents that we know is going to dispute by this particular person. So we pull an evidence of this, and we had to get them all typed out. We typed them in, and then or we can correct anything if there were typos in there. And she basically takes all of that. And she's trying to establish, again, using the computer, patterns and isolating on the function words within that person's consciousness. So even if they were dictated, as opposed to handwritten letters that really are transcribed, it's only reflecting the thought pattern of the person that produced a particular document. And so all the knowns get fed in, and then patterns are established, and then the unknowns, what she did was kind of interesting. She took all of them, regardless of author attribution, in one round of tests, and sort of put those against all of the knowns by all the different people. There were 17 total documents, 8 or 9 different authors. And I asked her, why would you do that round of testing? And she said, if some of these documents, regardless of who the authorship is attributed to, if they start matching each other, regardless of their name, that's going to tell us that there may be a common head in producing them.
Right. Which I thought, because I mean, one second, and that's fascinating. What is her record? In other words, this sort of test must have some sort of percentage of success associated with it historically, right?
Well, there's going to be in the results that are produced, you're going to have this. If you look at the actual document, the actual article on the website, I have the Excel tables reproduced in that document. So it's a PDF, and there's going to be a number. I hate to use the word percentage, but I'm not a math person, so I'll use it. There's a percentile number that is produced by the databases and the procedures that she uses. And she will then, she actually would tell me, because I can't decipher this, she told me what the numbers meant as far as, okay, this one, fits in with the patterning of the nouns, and so I would colorize them in the document for the reader. This one doesn't, this one does. And then she actually went through every line of the spreadsheet that she sent. She would highlight which one compared to her eye. Mathematically, again, I don't like comment. I'm sorry to interrupt. I know you're having a hard time hearing when I start to talk, but this is really important to me to understand what her record is. In other words, what her in past documents of the same sort. Is she right 80% of the time, 70% of the time, 50% of the time, 99.9? What kind of hit record does she have? I'm trying to so what kind of science we got here? Yeah, she's going to be well into the 90s because her work is regularly tested in court, like under oath and things like that. So anyone who's interested in her, again, go to her website. She describes different court cases that she's been part of and what she did, what she was at.
No, she's fine. If it's in the 90s, that's fine. I'm just wanting to understand the science that we're hearing about. So, I think that genetics is like billions, right? Genetics, I believe that's like your child. So, 90% then or better.
So what the end result was of the 17 documents that were tested, and it's a limited pool, and only the ones that have an authorship attribution. Only one of them, she was able to look at. This one is legit. And that was the General Twining memo to General George Shulgin. It's a 1947 document. The other ones did not align with the knowns by the same author. And so she said, in a court case, this would just get thrown out. We could not draw any conclusion. We cannot say anything factual about this document. We couldn't base anything factual on this particular document. So one passed the test. The most interesting thing to me was that 8 of them had authorial affinities with documents in the pool that were supposedly authored by somebody else. And she said, look, it doesn't prove that the documents were produced by a common suggested. She was real picky about her terminology there. And I reproduced her terminology in the document. She would say, it doesn't prove that they were all manufactured by the same hand, but
quick question, Mike. The 20 document wanted to be authenticated. Could you give all of us an idea of what was the essence of the frame?
It would probably be looked at as neutral by you and UFO enthusiasts. There's no extraterrestrial speculation in that one. It's the one where Twining says that, within his phrases, within present U.S. knowledge, we could reproduce these kind of craft that he was talking about. If any of your listeners are going to look at the document, it's point F in the document where that language comes from. It talks about in speeds of 7,000 miles an hour that are subsonic. Twining's assessment in that particular document is that we're not thinking extraterrestrial here. Now, obviously, there are other documents within the Majestic, cache that we couldn't test because they have no authorship attribution. So the study itself was limited, but I actually mentioned this one other thing to give Stan Freeman some kudos here. I deliberately also chose, again, when there was an author, documents that Freeman and others had by other means forensically shown the fakes. And her study flagged those same documents. They did not pass the test, only one did. So I didn't tell her about that either. I sort of viewed that for my own sake, that I don't understand the science. I'm depending on her. There would be something wrong if one of those came up good when I knew they weren't. And so it actually validated, some of what the work that Stan had done on some of these other documents. Now I know he's very committed to the extraterrestrial, view of the documents. So it doesn't prove or disprove that. It does show, though, that there's a lot in this that really looks suspicious. And that shouldn't be earth-shattering either, because anybody who knows about the history of how we got the Majestic documents, it's a very shady history. I mean, for your listeners, again, I think one of the best things they can read on this is the 2007 Ufos Symposium document. It was updated with research. I will link to that on my quick link site. But I'm kind of sour on the Majestic documents, and I know that there's a lot that's post 1989, which is a year that matters for this discussion that could very well be genuine, and some of the older ones might be, but it's got such a checkered history that I don't feel like we can trust them for a whole lot.
Okay, so other than climbing up, the others showed basically attributes that would say, look here, the same person wrote all of these.
And for instance, they're looking at a Hillenkotter document that matched the profile of a JFK document. That just shouldn't happen. Because they're different people, and she gets flagged at 8 of the 17, just sort of, somehow like sore thumbs to her that she just thought there's something not right here. She flagged those right off the bat. The other ones didn't pass the test for other reasons. But those each needed here just look suspicious.
And my next question is about the UFO community. In other words, when you came out with these findings, how did the UFO community so angry people actually flag you?
Well, it was mixed as you might expect. I unveiled this at a conference here in Roswell, and Rich Sullivan and I talked afterwards. Rich was really enthusiastic about it. I mean, he more or less said, this is the kind of thing we need to be doing. And I expect that from Rich. I think Rich is a serious researcher and have a high regard for his commitment to doing research. My biggest disappointment was actually Stan Freeman, because he didn't really hear anything about it. I think he somehow got my novel, which is there's a lot of religious angle to it, and the whole UFO question confused with this report, because he sort of went off on it, and I was a religious fundamentalist or something like that. It's like, Stan, it validates this other work he did. I think I want to actually read the document. I'm not going to confuse with the novel songs, but that was a surprise. That's okay.
I just find it as an author, like, to suggest us listening to that your religious background influenced you in some way. I mean, I think it's a fair question.
Well, it would be if I had written any of the documents, and if I was the computational linguist that had it tested, and I was the computational linguist that produced the program that had it tested. I'm none of those things. I was just the guy that said, hey, here's somebody who does this for a living. Would she be interested in testing these documents? And she was. So it didn't really go anywhere as far as a huge impact, because, to be honest with you, people are sort of committed to what side of this question they're on. Most people, are more interested in looking at evidence that kind of, leans the way they hope it leans. I want to know because I'm a language guy, and we do this kind of work, in the office with not forensic, office of attribution, but we do a lot of stuff with software that applies to languages. So this seems an area that I could actually contribute something into ufology. So we did it.
Okay, well, it certainly wouldn't surprise that a lot of people would perhaps accept Sam's social and you are going to particular point of view. And that's that point of view. And I'm not suggesting that there's anything wrong with finals or guessing or anything else, but I can still want people, right, so you're married a certain point as well.
Well, I don't really care one way or the other. Well, if there are aliens out there, then great. I just like to know, and I'd like there to be real evidence. I don't want cloak and dagger anecdotes. I don't want, accusations going from this ufologist back to that ufologist where I have to pick which one I like. That is not data. And if that irritates people, well, I'm not responsible for that.
Okay. All right. No, that's entirely fair. You also debunked the ancient astronaut idea, right? I mean, what about the long runways down south and all of that? Or all of the rocks that decorated image show aliens with space helmets and all of it? In what way do you feel? In other words, do you have something, I don't know, equivalent to what you did when you just did Oculus when it comes to ancient alien theory?
I don't, in my mind, I distinguish everything we've talked about up to this point. The question of are there extraterrestrials, are these documents real or not, and so on and so forth. I distinguish all of that. To me, that's serious ufology. The ancient alien stuff, I don't take seriously at all, because I do know ancient texts, I do know ancient history, I know where to get the information, archaeology, anthropology, all this stuff. And that part, I know they get lumped together, and I understand why they get lumped together. But I treat one seriously, and I treat the other not seriously, because frankly, the work is extraordinarily poor, and in many cases, just literally made up. And I don't think it really deserves the amount of attention that the other part of ufology gets.
So there is some hard evidence in forms of pictograms and runways, that kind of thing.
So we have a pictogram from a foreign culture. We have no text that tells us what it is. Right? So what we have, and this is blunt reality, this is real little here. We have a picture that I'm going to use my 21st century mind, part of which is influenced by this narrative, and now I'm going to interpret that picture. I could be miles and miles and miles and miles and miles away from anything accurate, and in most cases, people have been able to produce the same picture in other provenance objects where it's clear as to what the purpose of this thing was, or what, and there might be a text that goes with it. That's when you really get lucky, when there's actually textual material that goes with it. And enough bad work has been demonstrated in that area, and it's inherently subjective. To me, it's the badness of the work that's out there that I will admit colors my opinion of the enterprise, of the whole thing. I'll give you an example. We have these quote-unquote reptilian figurines that are circulating on the web, and people are referring to them as Anunnaki figurines. Well, guess what? Yeah, they come from Iraq, but they come from a civilization that predated the writing period. They predate the Sumerian text, but they don't have any text on them. Why? Because writing hasn't been invented yet. There's nothing about the object that tells you anything about it. Identifies it in any way. Okay, we'll take it, just run with it.
All right, we'll write that for a second line. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back. Fascinating stuff. So Welcome to the world. The pictures on the left of aliens, spaceships, Ufos, from the world. This is the place. Multiple wheels will travel around. Hi, Mike, welcome back. I guess you're not worried about interruption, but the Anunnaki stuff, right?
Well, as far as ancient aliens goes, no. The Anunnaki, of course, show up in Sumerian cuneiform texts. I mean, they're a little over 100 times. You know, I should say something. I don't know whether to encourage people to go see this or not. One of the things I did on my website is devoted to Zechariah Sitchin and ancient astronaut stuff was, I figured, well, I don't want people to just take my word for it. When I say insane things like, look, the fundamental ideas of what Zechariah Sitchin is saying, that the Anunnaki come from the Nibiru, that they were here to mine gold, and Nibiru is this planet beyond Saturn, all really the fundamental tenets of the system. Rather than take my word for it, what I did was I created a screen capture video of me going to a website called the Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature. And I know it doesn't sound exciting. I think they're not really well or radio or really anything for that matter. I put in a search for the term Anunnaki, and the video is me putting the search term in, clicking the button, getting all of the occurrences of the term Anunnaki, where they occur in the tablets, getting them back in the search, showing people out, look, if you hit PR here, that takes you to an English translation. There are 117 or so of these. This is on my website. The Sitchin website, such as
you did this why?
so that people can watch it and do it themselves. Because I don't like arguments from authority. Yeah, here's Mike with a PhD in ancient Semitic languages and all this stuff. Big deal. Okay, you should not have to depend on what Mike says about this. Go to the site, run the search, click translation, and you will see that I'm correct here. Okay, none of these ideas about the Anunnaki that Sitchin really depends on to roll out his extraterrestrial narrative. The texts don't say anything about the Anunnaki in regard to these ideas at all. It literally doesn't even exist. It's not a question of, well, Mike would translate it this way, but someone else would translate it that way. I'm saying the material doesn't even exist. Now, if I made a crazy claim like that without knowing that it was real, I mean, I'd have to have my head examined, okay? But I got so tired of trying to explain to people this is not a translation issue, at least in regard to the Anunnaki.
I was guessing the implication that Zechariah needs was shit.
No, the late Zechariah Sitchin does not need his head examined. What I think, and I've heard people say really nasty things about Sitchin, and I just think are nutty. Okay, Zechariah Sitchin is a reptilian. Yeah, I do not think he's an Illuminati agent.
No, but everything pretty much that he thought was wrong.
I think his narrative, his explanation of the Sumerian text is completely wrong. What I think he actually did is he reads the text in translation using Kramer or some other known translation at the time, and I think he essentially created what you could loosely call an allegory. And I think he tried to marry what he was reading with the characters and the mythologies, and then he would get into cosmological texts. And he married that somewhat to Velikovsky, the whole world's in collision thing.
Right. Well, I interviewed him many times, and he, believe me, was very, very married to it. There's no question about it.
Oh, I know. He was absolutely committed to it.
Like an article of faith.
Yeah. And I'm just saying, look, there's just nothing here. I mean, it's not the same in other issues, that where you do, there are are issues of this is a good translation, that's a bad translation. Yeah, it's not anything you can put in one category. But as far as I should mention this too. One of the other things I did besides creating that exciting video for people was I looked up all of the scholarly academic articles on the Anunnaki I could find. There were 3 of them. Unfortunately, they were all in German. There's nothing more recent than the mid-20th century. And I hired someone, a specialist in German, to translate the documents. People can get those translations as they are. It's a lot of pages because they're 50, 60 pages, but you can actually have the best research on the Anunnaki of Sumerian, Assyrian scholars. I try to do this because I don't want people depending on Mike. I don't like arguments from authority. I like to direct people back to primary texts and say, don't just go read them. Don't take some of these papers. Just go read the things, and you'll see.
Sorry. Here's Linda, who sent me a message. Art, he does not believe the scientists who carbon date things. If you come up with a test done by other scientists, he will tell you that they did it wrong or made mistakes. Unfair?
Yeah. What's wrong with carbon dating?
I don't know.
Carbon dating?
Linda apparently heard you reference something. It was carbon dating.
If I got one of these today, let's use this. Here's a good teaching point here. This is what Mike will do. I got an email from somebody that sent me a picture of an object and says, what do you think of this object that I discovered? And, it starts telling me what it is. Okay, and that's ancient alien stuff. My first question is always, okay, I need to know where it was provenanced. In other words, where was it discovered? I need to know that it was not a disturbed site. Can you direct me to the publication, to the archaeological publication? I have access to lots of databases as a faculty member. I can get to a lot of things that other people can't. Can you give me the archaeologist's name or the art? I mean, I'll find it if you give me the information, and I'll go. And maybe I'll post it on a blog if you like. I mean, I'll ask them. 99% of the time, I don't get anything back. What I want is I want real data. If you give me a carbon date, my first question will be, who dated it? Show me the report. All this stuff gets published. This is not, secrecy. There are millions and millions and millions of pages put out in the social sciences, archaeology, anthropology, every blasted year. Okay, I can get that stuff. I want to go read it so that I know, sort of where to start. Who did this? Who discovered it? I'll email those people and say, hey, Professor so-and-so, I read your article of this and that, and I have a question. I'll do stuff like that. I don't think that's unreasonable.
No, it's not unreasonable. But again, when people look at you, they
get irritated.
No, absolutely.
I call myself the equal opportunity offender because I'll do this with Christians that email me too about some point of, well, you're a heretic out there because you don't believe in the global flood, or you don't believe in this, or you don't believe in that, and whether I do or not, or most of the time they're just repeating something they heard. I'm going to ask them for the same thing because look, even if I like your position, a bad argument in defense of a good position is still a crappy argument. That's what it is. So wouldn't you rather have a good argument for what you believe as opposed to a bad one? And people get they get angry.
Okay, let's try this. Look, the world has been around for a very, very long time. I don't know if you saw the series on TV about after man or after man, and it showed how quickly society, the buildings, the things that we see every day would be dust and gone. And the answer is pretty quickly. So is it really beyond reason to suggest that there could have been others here from elsewhere, or there could have been civilizations prior to the one we're so proud of right now?
Well, that's an argument that can actually be used, both ways to argue and also to argue against that point. And the other problem is it's an argument from silence. Well, I don't see a whole lot of buildings in this place, but boy, the Earth's been around here so long, so they must have been here. That's kind of really not a sound argument. I mean, in theory, we have evidence of writing, which is a mark of a high civilization. People don't stop to think about how important writing is that you need, to preserve thought for the next generation on practical things, how to build things, how to make things, so on and so forth. So I would expect, if there were like these long ago civilizations, like let's say Blavatsky talks about, millions and millions and millions of years. Well, it's really convenient to attach that number to it because then you think that exempts you from having any evidence. Well, it really doesn't, because if you're going to make the claim, I need to know that the claim is reasonable. And I don't think that is an unreasonable thing to ask for. I can sit here and say, well, it's possible. Sure, Art, it's possible. Sure, whatever, the questioner's name was, that's possible. It's possible maybe in the sense that I could be the next American Idol. Okay, that's possible too. I could wake up tomorrow with a bump on the head, and I wake up and I have a great voice. I audition for the show, and I win the American Idol. Yeah, that's possible. Really?
Well, that is not what I've heard so far tonight. I mean, it's a great conversation, but we're not singing, we're not.
It ain't gonna be. But it's possible. Stranger things. I mean, you see where the conversation goes. So, on the one hand, I don't have any problem saying, well, that could be, but I'm not going to base what I think or believe on a could be. I think it's more reasonable to just ask, is there one thing that makes this a little more kind of concrete, that takes it out of the realm of complete speculation into the realm of, hey, look at this thing we have here. We need to think about this object or this text. I just don't think it's unreasonable. And I know it irritates.
All right, my God.
It irritates my wife when I'm like that, too.
We apply the same standards of proof, Mike, to the concept of intelligent design.
Yeah, I've said for a long time that I think intelligent design really doesn't prove anything. If I can be really blunt about it. I mean, intelligent design is not really a theory about who the designer or designers are. I've said for many years that, look, you can take all the arguments for intelligent design and put an S on the end, and you can make the same arguments. And again, a Christian audience, that just irritates the heck out of them, because they're going to assume that the designer must be the God of the Bible. And it's like, well, sure, I want to think that too. But if we're actually looking at the argument, intelligent design, all it argues for is that the best explanation for some natural phenomena is some sort of intelligent cause. And it's a reasoning by analogy. Here's a thing that looks like it has intricate design, therefore it probably maybe had a designer. Okay, that's wonderful if you can test it. But ultimately, at the end of the day, even if you're right, you still don't know who the designer is. Okay, and so it's extremely limited. I don't want to say it's not useful, because I think it is. I don't want to see God divorced from the conversation, about creation and things like that. But the other side of it is it's quite limited. It's more limited than the average person who gets excited about it, really thinks about it.
Do you believe in intelligent design, one way or the other, whether you say God did it, or it was a natural process with somebody's hand in it, or an extraterrestrial hand, or whatever? Do you believe in intelligent design, or is it all random?
I do believe that there is a creator.
A creator.
Right.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is I see a philosophical necessity to have a distinction between creation and the causation. There's some causation, whether that's an impersonal thing like Big Bang or whatever. That's you're at a different level of questioning there. I don't see it all as one. I'm not a monist. I would be a dualist. There's a distinction between creation and then its causation. And so because I hold that position, yeah, I think that there are some things that do speak to intelligent design, but in terms of an honest philosophical argument, winning that particular argument does not link that argument to a specific creator. And that's just being honest with the philosophical argument. And most intelligent design theorists themselves will tell you that. I mean, when this kind of stuff filters down into the lay community and the internet, and it starts to become more of a religious argument.
So you do believe, boil it down, in intelligent design, that there was a creator. Is that creator the one of the Bible?
I think that any creator would have to be a creator like is described in the Bible, and that is totally distinct from creation. And again, characteristics of omnipotence and that sort of thing. I don't believe, however, that creation had to be perfect. In fact, I actually think this gets me in trouble again with the Christian camp. I don't think that the Bible describes a perfect creation. That opens all kinds of worms for that audience. But when you start to say things like, well, the creator would have done this or that, or would not have done this or that, and evolutionists who want to be materialists, who are atheistic, they say these things all the time. Well, you can't have intelligent design because God wouldn't have done this, would he? Well, you're making a theological argument. I hope you realize that, Mr. Scientist. That's a theological argument. You're telling me what the deity that you don't believe in would or would not have done. That's not a science-based argument. That is a theological argument. So, again, just to get that off the table, I don't believe that imperfection argues against intelligent design. Let's just put it that way.
Okay. Do you think that the process of evolution is ongoing, as in still?
Yeah, I don't see, if we accept the idea of evolution, I don't think that there would be any way to coherently demonstrate that it's all stopped. I don't know how you demonstrate that. I don't see any reason to conclude that.
Mm-hmm. Well, where do you think we're going? Like with quantum physics, it is a real mystery. Spooky action at a distance, or whatever it was that Einstein said about it. It is pretty weird stuff to try and wrap your mind around. What do you think?
I'm fascinated. I'm not a physicist. I don't have the mechanical mind to really grasp a lot of this stuff, but I think that stuff is just fascinating. I also think it's a friend of theology. And again, this is going to get me in trouble with that part of your audience, but whatever. Think of it this way. Most Christians, many Christians, whether they could tell you where the idea comes from, are really disturbed by the idea that God doesn't have everything predestined. If I walk into a room full of Christians to speak on something, I say, hey, look, I don't believe that everything's nailed down. I don't believe that foreknowledge, God's foreknowledge, necessitates his predestining of all things. That freaks people out, okay? But that's exactly what quantum physics has demonstrated. There's this certain random quality to it. And I can show you passages in the New Testament that talk about how the creation mirrors the character of the Creator. I can take you to passages that very clearly show that God foreknows things that do not come to pass. And that tells you immediately, point blank, that God knew something that didn't come to pass, therefore that thing was not predestinated. I hate to say it this way, a lot of Christians are not very familiar with their Bible. They aren't aware of a lot of these things in it. Again, the academics, this stuff gets thrown around all the time. But when you try to, do stuff on the internet, when you try to do stuff on radio, you try to get people interested in the discussion. People don't like it. I don't know how else to put it. I mean, I
would it be interesting to actually give the Bible to that same lady who looked at the Majestic documents?
We haven't actually talked to her about that. This is an interesting rabbit trail. Her undergraduate degree, Carol's undergraduate degree was in Greek. So I'll just describe what we have asked her in the past. There are certain books of the New Testament that are what are called disputed authorship books, pastoral epistles, for instance. That would be 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, are sort of notorious in the academic realm for scholars fighting about did Paul really write this or not. So we've asked her, hey, are you interested in this because we can give you, the digital form of the New Testament and check out authorship attribution. And of course, she brings up the obvious problem. Well, you have to also hand me documents to create a profile that you know for certain were written by this particular individual. And she, and frankly, we wonder, could we do that? Because most of Paul's letters, we'll just use Paul for an example, most of Paul's letters are disputed in some way at some point in the letters, even the ones that are sort of, everybody accepts as genuinely Pauline. So is there a way we could actually construct this test? There have been whole books on something called stylometry, trying to test this. Now, Carol's methods are a little different, and there are computational linguists in our field who are applying this to certain books, usually in the New Testament because it's shorter. It takes less work to produce the raw data. And the results are mixed. But she has her own unique approach. So that might happen. We might be able to, convince her to do this, and it would have to be, worthwhile. We want to get something publishable out of it. But there are scholars who can do that.
You wouldn't be afraid of that.
Oh no, I think it'd be very interesting. Again, my view of inspiration, this is a theological term that Christians throw around a lot, and conservative Jews throw it around too. Scripture comes from God. Well, I believe that. I think that God, if I embrace the idea of a creator, the idea that a deity could influence somebody to write something seems like a pretty short jump. I mean, I can do that. I can influence somebody to write something down for posterity, big deal. So I don't view inspiration as a paranormal event, like the prophet wakes up and starts making breakfast, and then God zaps him, and his mind leaves his body, and then he wakes up an hour later and looks down at his text and says, "Boy, wow, look at that! Didn't I do a great job of that?" Because that isn't the way it's described even in the Bible. It's a very human process where specific literary genres are used, specific forms of literature, like an Old Testament passage about a treaty. Well, guess what? It'll conform to treaty patterns in the ancient Near East. Law codes will conform. Writers would do this because if they didn't do it, you'd think they were hacks. You'd think they wouldn't know what they're doing. Like, does this guy know how to write a treaty? I mean, what a bonehead. Okay, look, the writers were people. And they used the tools, the knowledge, the vocabulary at their time to produce what, I would say what God wanted them ultimately to do. I have a very providential view of inspiration that's very human. God plays the ultimate role, preparing them in their lives for that moment to produce that thing. Yeah, there are certainly genetic arguments against it. I've actually followed this one for the last 2 or 3 years pretty closely. It's quite controversial even within Christian circles because you have Christian geneticists on both sides of this one. Here in my neck of the woods, there is the guy lives who's more or less started the whole thing. Dennis Venema of Trinity Western produced an article that really argued against the historical Adam and Eve because of statistics that you can't account for populations as we know them as coming from a single pair. And that's been batted around quite a bit. Some people, when I think about this, some people would say, well, we don't really need to care about a single pair because if we go back to a literal reading of Genesis after the flood, we have more than one pair. We have 4, Noah and his sons. And so then the argument proceeds from there. My view is I don't think that theologically we have to affirm a historical Adam, although I'm not convinced that we shouldn't affirm that. In other words, I think the genetics is still divided on the issue. So But, 5, 10, 20 years, we may, statistical genetics might be an area that really gets a lot of attention, more work's put into it. We might have something more conclusive than it is now, but there are good arguments.
You sound pretty unsure, but
I don't know where to come down.
Yeah, but I have noticed that arguments that could go either way. Like somebody who is a little worried to what he believes, you have them fall down in your direction.
I don't know me that's enough. For your readers or your listeners, I think one of the better books on this is by a guy named Peter Enns. It's about the historical Adam, the evolution of Adam, it's called. And Enns is an Old Testament scholar like I am. I know Pete. And he got into trouble for a neutral position on this, or actually one that favored the evolutionary argument. But his argument is actually text-based, and that is he marshals a lot of evidence, depending on the dissertation that somebody else wrote, in part, that the story of Adam is actually a deliberate parallel to the story of Israel. And if that's the case, then the whole point of the story of Adam might be, again, something literary, talking about the nation, using this story to parallel the history of the nation. I think it's
metaphorical. It's a metaphorical.
Yeah, right. And I think he does a good job of laying it out for the non-specialists. It's controversial. I like parts of what his argument says. I like, I don't like other parts of it. But I think in this case, I don't think genetics lies, obviously. I do think, though, that, and the people who are in the field will tell you this, in the articles they produce, that statistical genetics is still somewhat new because the genome isn't that recent, but it's a burgeoning field. So I think for this one, it's like 10, 20 years down the road, we may have something more conclusive. But either way, in terms of biblical scholarship or theology, I think this is something that could go either way. And I know that would upset a lot of people for different reasons. But again, and for those of you who are Christians out there listening, I can say this because I do not take Romans 5 the same way most of you do. So we'll just leave it there, I guess.
So when you get to the genetics, you would think the percentages would be way below what the MJ12 document Peter came.
Well, I don't know that I was qualified to comment or comparison because I don't really know either field. But genetics says a lot. I mean, we depend on genetics for a lot of different things. In terms of medicine, agriculture, all sorts of things. I mean, genetics is genetics. I mean, it's real. The data are real. The issue is the statistical analysis of the data. So who knows? Carol might be able to look at it and say, well, this is like what I do or not like what I do. I'm just not qualified to say that, make that comparison.
Okay. Well, I was just interested in the weight that you put on one versus the other.
If people want to go, if you're interested in this question for your listeners, again, you go to my website, drmsh.com. Up at the top, one of my blogs is called The Naked Bible. You click on that, and you can go to that site, and on that site, there's a tab that talks about anthropology, biblical anthropology, which includes the Adam question. And there's one on Romans 5. Again, I think it's a key passage of this. I've blogged a lot on this because I'm interested in genetics. I think it's kind of fascinating. Again, even though I can't digest a lot of it, I'm really fascinated by it.
Well, if genetics comes along and begins to say things that are, I don't know, in direct contrast to what you believe, and I know you do have faith, Mike, and some of what you say has got to be influenced by that faith. It'd be an uneven world if it was not so. So would you admit that is to some degree true?
Well, here's my secret, Art. Your listeners can get the alert here. I don't believe at all that Genesis and the Bible, for that matter, was written, was inspired to teach us science. Okay. We talk a lot about the need to interpret the Bible in context.
Especially, and you think it was metaphorical. Really?
No. I think the context for the Bible is the context that produced it. In other words, it's not the Reformation, it's not the early church, it's not the Catholic Church, it's not this creed or that creed. The context that produced the Bible is the one that was around when the biblical writers were living and writing. And as a scholar, and as a close reader of the text in the original languages, what you have in Genesis is really, really close, very similar, because of the common worldview, to other ancient Near Eastern cosmologies. You know, they're not trying to teach us science, they're trying to teach us theological messaging. And we have a creator, here's who the creator is, it's Yahweh, the God of Israel. Humanity's here because he wants them here. We are his imagers, we're his representatives. That should work its way out into our lives in certain ways. They're not scientists, they live in a pre-scientific world, so the messaging isn't about science. Now, I don't think the theological messaging contradicts science, though. I am atheist. I am someone who believes in a creator, and I can, stack PhDs all night long of people in the hard sciences I personally know who would stand with me in belief in a creator. I don't think it overturns that apple cart at all. Now, what's problematic about that with a lot of hearers, people that would hear me, is that they're used to having their Bible filtered to them through a creed or a tradition. And I'm not antagonistic to creeds and traditions. I'm more apathetic toward them. And I'll grant you, I can say that because I've had the training, I know all the languages and all that stuff, but I have to be honest with people and say, look, this is the way I look at things. I take the Bible for what it is. I do believe there's a God. I believe in a creator. I believe that the God is behind this thing we call the Bible. But we have to put it in its own context and ask ourselves what I think are reasonable questions. Why would God choose this time and place to do this? What's the point of it? What is he trying to message to us, and what is peripheral? Things like this. So as a scholar, I'm very mainstream in that, but when it comes to, people who, don't work in the field, some things I say can bother. And I understand why that is, but I just can't filter
people. A lot of them against other people. For example, I had a fellow on named Matthew Alperth recently. Matthew wrote a book called The God or the Brain. Have you ever heard of that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and I've heard, not the most recent show, but I've heard previous shows with Matthew.
All right, so basically, he's saying that human beings have an innate fear of their own mortality. And the brain has adapted over time to embrace the concept of a creator in order to assuage that fear of mortality. And it is a reasonable thing to imagine. I wonder how you address something like that.
Well, your audience will understand when I say this, and I'll try to unpack it. If I had to put my money on Matthew Alper or Dean Radin, my money's on Dean. In other words, Alper's position depends on philosophical materialism. That all that is real is somehow biologically based or material based. Okay, I don't believe that. Lots of people don't believe it who have nothing theological invested in it, and lots of neuroscientists don't believe it. The real question comes down to, is all this stuff something the brain produces or something the brain receives or mediates or filters? You have the radio and you have radio waves. Okay, one of Alper's saying, well, if you took this gene out or you took this drug, it would sort of shut the thing off. Well, if I took the battery out of a radio that I've been listening to, I cannot conclude that the radio waves are not still there.
Well, one of the things that he did say, I want you to address this, is that, look, if you take somebody who is very religious and they have an accident, they hit their head, many times they're suddenly not religious anymore.
Exactly what I would expect. That phenomenon works just fine with the idea that the brain is a receiver or filter of consciousness. You do not need to have the idea that the brain produces consciousness or is to explain that. Both paradigms can explain that very same thing. And I think on one hand, what Albert's saying is I think more intelligent than weird stuff like the God helmet guy, which I think is just ridiculous. So I'm going to give Albert credit for coming up with a more thoughtful idea. It's not unique with him. I mean, if anybody who's studied, and this is something else I'm interested in, the whole problem, quote unquote, of consciousness, gets into the mind-body problem, the mind-body issue. And neuroscientists are divided on this issue. I mean, I would want to know things like, well, why doesn't everyone believe in God then? Why do some people who believe in God later embrace atheism? Well, why are conceptions of God so different?
Right, let me repeat, the percentages are very, very high. I mean, even if you go to islands,
percentages per which?
Those who believe either in God or a God, those who worship, it's almost universal. You can go to islands that have been very
I would expect that.
Okay.
Well, I mean, again, if we're going to, let's just throw the Bible in here again. Romans 1, Ecclesiastes teach the idea that since we are made by God, we are designed, to want to seek Him. We have this innate sense, innate urge, again, and if we don't have that relationship, we have this gap and this empty space in us. So again, it's a very first century or more ancient way of saying just what you said. And we would expect that if we are made in God's image, there would be something in us that would be attracted to Him, that would seek Him, that would feel incomplete without it. So that doesn't surprise me at all. Again, going back to the two sides of the issue, you don't need Albert's position to explain that.
Albert would agree with a lot of what you just said.
I know, and neuroscientists who would disagree with his explanation of it would also agree with him. There's a lot of agreement here. It comes down again to that sort of radio analogy. Is it the thing that produces the sound waves or does it receive them from somewhere else? So ultimately it comes down to this issue of, are you a materialist or are you not?
What about, let's go back for a second to intelligent design. What about the argument that as we look around us every day, everything is just as it has to be? Now, you can attribute that to a maker, or you can attribute that we're here and we wouldn't be unless it was as it must be. We came up in a world where we need this kind of oxygen mix, the right gases, there's water, there's everything that we need. Or you can attribute that to a designer, if you wish, or you can attribute it to the fact that it couldn't be any other way. And
that's true. And someone who, you've interviewed Hugh Ross before. This is exactly where Hugh Ross is at. The so-called anthropic principle. Right? The second option, if I were Hugh Ross, I would say, well, isn't that less of an explanation than the first option? Because the first option allows the second to exist, whereas the second one doesn't allow the first to exist. In other words, we're designed as intelligent beings. Intelligent beings will at some point ask that question. So that's a long way of saying, both are on the table. Both people, both options are held by different people, and that's kind of where these arguments fall. Which becomes a philosophical argument rather than a scientific argument. Which one is more coherent? And that's where the argument takes place. I think the argument for theism is more coherent.
Well, do you think that if you were addressing a whole room full of ufologists, would you basically tell them they're wasting their time?
No. If it's ancient alien stuff, I would say yes, you're wasting your time. If it's, again, what I define as serious ufology, again, I think most people who witness these things are being very forthright. They're telling the truth. I saw this or that. So I don't think this is a field that is full of. We have hoaxers, but I don't think it's full of them or people who want publicity and all. Again, we know those people are out there, but for the most part, I think people really are serious about it, really want to know. And I'm in that bunch that would like to know. And so if we're talking about in our world today, again, back to the technological and the biological question, since I think it's reasonable to discuss the idea that extraterrestrials could exist, then I'd like to know if they do, and if this particular sighting or crash or whatever it is, that might help us answer one of those questions. Why shouldn't we be doing that? So I don't think they're wasting their time at all.
Okay, here's one for you. This is just a what if. I kind of like to know how light would react. Okay, all right?
Yeah, sure.
If we were contacted, if we were suddenly to receive a signal, and that signal was verified by everybody inside as being extraterrestrial, and the signal included the information that yes, we have been watching you since it all began for you, since you became intelligent beings, and we are your makers. I wonder how you personally would react.
I would like proof for that. In other words, the fact that you're a communicative being that's been around longer than we have, and has some whatever point of superior technology. I've learned from my human experience that advanced technology does not translate necessarily to truth-telling and good motives or ethics. And so I'm going to assume that you perhaps evolved along the same trajectories, and so I need you to prove that case. And then I'd also like to know, why are you telling me that? Are you trying to make me fear you? Are you just preparing, me for your overlordship? Or what is it? I mean, I would want it to be a conversation rather than a statement. And I think a lot of what I would take past that would have a lot to do with the reaction.
I don't know, perhaps as a father would sit down with a joint son and explain to him that, son, you're 21 now, and I'm going to tell you that we adopted you when you were very young, or something like that. In other words, we had matured to the point that we were prepared, or we were ready to hear something like that.
Right. Well, I would want to know. I mean, I'd have questions. Well, I would want proof, but in that scenario, I'd also want to know why. And why. And I know you're telling me that I had to be at a certain maturity level. I get that part. But I want to know things about, well, why was I up for adoption? What about my biological parent? I would want to know what the history is behind that a little bit. So I think my own reflex, given the first scenario with the extraterrestrial question, I think it'd be very natural to have, questions that relate to validation. I think as human beings, that's a normal reflex with us. I don't see any reason to suppress it or to hide it at that point.
All right, hold it right there. We've got what I want to do is open the phone lines, okay? 1-855-REAL UFO. That's 855-REAL UFO from Mike Heiser. Very, very interesting discussion. My guest is Mike Heiser, and I'd love to have him get into it with him if you would like to. The numbers are easy, 855-REAL-UFO. That translates to 855-722-5836. The field is wide open. One of those question we have always certainly clear. Phone and join the like if you're ready for some questions.
Absolutely, that's what the show's about.
That's what it's about, that's right. Dark Matter, you are on the air with Mike Heiser. Hello. Hello. Yes, hi. Yes.
Hi, Mike. I have a question for you. Right at the beginning of the show, you mentioned that you needed proof for UFOs or ancient aliens and so forth and so on. But you said the Bible as set in stone, like it's the law. It's actually literal. but there's no proof of the Bible or God. Can you provide proof that there is a God or a creator?
Well, I didn't say that the Bible is literal. A couple times during the conversation, I've pretty much said the exact opposite. The fundamental question is, can I prove there's a God? If you're asking for scientific proof, the answer is no, because, again, the theological idea, the philosophical idea, is that God is distinct from creation, so you can't put him under a microscope and prove him. And this is why the argument is philosophical. And what I mean by that is, what is more coherent? The idea that everything is here because of nothing, or everything is here because of something. So when it comes to the philosophical argument, yeah, I think there are really good philosophical arguments that favor the existence of a being that we would call God.
Okay, so the being could be God, or it could be an alien or another.
In terms of an alien, I think we have to be on the same page here. I kind of think we are. I define the alien as an extraterrestrial life form that is the product of evolution, and so that's quite different than God. So there's a disconnect there. I'd have to hear what you thought about that.
Okay, because in terms of other systems or God or Adam and Eve, I mean, I look at the Bible and it depends. You take some passages as literal, some as metaphoric, and again, you went back to the author, the writers of the Bible. How can you prove that what they've written in the Bible itself is literal or metaphoric? Or, what do you think about that?
Well, on one level, I don't care, because I think the point of the Bible is not to teach us science. Now, I think creation is something that we should study, something that God would expect us to study. Science is just as much of a worthy endeavor as, pastoring a church or something like that. It's not a set of ideas. And I think the ideas, not just with the Bible, but other ancient texts are coherent. We didn't put creation here. The creation we experience to see, we're not responsible for it, so somebody else must be. Again, that takes you to this idea of a creator, and I think that's a reasonable assumption. It didn't make
I think that a lot of ideas that talk about previous civilizations and or creatures from elsewhere, they're coherent. I think a lot of these ideas are coherent. And it does seem to me like that when it comes to those sorts of things, you demand a very great level of proof. But when it comes, you know where I'm going, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's not what the caller's saying here.
Well, when it comes to the demand for proof for a biological entity, I would like biology. When it comes to the demand for proof for a non-biological entity like God, then I think by definition we have to look at it philosophically as the rules of logic and think. It's kind of the difference between scientific evidence and legal evidence. We use them both, but they're not the same, and we can argue about which one's better. But the fact is that each of them applies in its different realm. So, I can't reproduce a crime or some event that happened in court. But I can argue, again, using the rules of logic and points of evidence for this scenario is more coherent than this other scenario over here. So I think the requirements for both are appropriate to the realms in which they're operating.
So you have faith in God, but in terms of a biological being, you need actual physical proof. Your faith in God is basically your proof that there is a creator, which you call God, correct?
I would not use the word faith. I would use the idea that there is a God is more reasonable. I don't really divorce reason and faith, that much. And some people do, some people don't. But I think faith without reason is pretty useless.
Right. I mean, I look at faith as just something in your head, just something that you believe in, but there's no actual proof.
But you do have reasons that you believe in whatever it is you believe, and I think that's perfectly appropriate. So what I'm saying is, I believe that it's more coherent to believe in a creator than not. I think that's more reasonable. And this isn't a logic class, so we don't need to put down a really boring road for radio. But I'm hoping you get the idea.
Yeah, I do. I'm just trying to understand like faith and actual proof of biological being the creator. Because when it comes to God, we all believe that God with our faith, not actual proof of any physical proof of an actual God, a biological being. Correct?
It's actually a little hard. It's actually a little hard to make a really clean cut distinction in some regards, because even in the realm of science, there's an interpretive aspect to certain things where we have data. Data is produced by scientific observation and inquiry and experimentation and all that. But when we think about the data, then we're actually in the other realm. Again, we have to form arguments and see if one is more coherent than another, how to parse whatever the data is in front of you.
We have hypotheses, right? And then we build experiments or studies or research to prove the hypothesis is correct or not. Right.
And that's why it's really nice, that part of that process is repeatability. Like in the courtroom, using that as an analogy, you can't depend on that, unfortunately. It's just a different realm, but the goals are the same at any rate.
Okay, well, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the call, and take care, and let's do this and say hello there. You're on the air. Well, line one, you're on the air.
Hello. Well, my question is, he says he doesn't believe in ancient aliens, but what about the drawings on the Mayan pyramids where they got, a spaceman and a spacesuit and a spaceship?
Ancient aliens.
I would suggest that you go to either YouTube or direct to the URL Ancient Aliens Debunked. It's a 3-hour video. It's free. It's got almost 2.5 million views, and one of the segments is about just that, the so-called Palenque astronaut. And I'd invite you to watch it. You can also go to the website and get a transcript of the actual video with resources with sources where the material is sourced. Basically, what's been interpreted as hardware, rocketry, that sort of thing, really are known motifs from other pieces of Mayan art that are about the underworld. So it's not about ancient astronauts at all. And I know for someone who's committed to the ancient astronaut view, they're not really going to swallow that. Okay, but what I would say is, look, go back. This is, a teaching moment here. We want to understand the culture on their terms. They didn't make just this one object. They made lots of objects. Okay, and some of those objects have text with them where you get the objects explained. Okay, underworld texts. So if you compare all the data collectively, the ancient astronaut view of that particular artifact is going to disappear. And again, my argument is primary source based.
Okay, when I was 10, I lived in Culver City, California. And there was a giant cigar-shaped, craft that flew between my yard and the neighbor's yard. And so many people thought it was on a weekend that it was on the news, and they called it a runaway missile. And it was probably back in 1968. But missiles don't have windows.
Yeah. That's ridiculous.
Yeah. So it was only 100 miles an hour.
I believe you entirely. I believe you saw what you saw. You're not making it up. My only question is, why would you conclude it's extraterrestrial? Again, because it's different. It's not what you normally see. We have lots of people who know more about ufology than I do. I've gone through and cataloged all these sorts of objects and technology. I really recommend for this one, triangle or otherwise, again, to go to my website, DR. Click on the quick links, and then look for my review of Marler's book on triangular UFOs. I pull out a lot of images, again, from patents and other technologies back in really the turn of the century, the late 1890s, all the way up to today, for all the different shapes. And that doesn't mean that what you saw is not extraterrestrial. It just means that what you saw has a really good explanation that might compete with that. So that's why I'm saying I need more. I need a biological entity, to move me to that position.
Oh, that's a triangle, in its hometown.
I wish I would see one. I mean, true confession to every time I go out and walk the dog, I look up at the sky, just hoping to see something that I never have.
So you've never seen anything?
I've never seen anything.
All right. I think we've got another caller online. You're on the air with Mike Heiser. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
How's it going?
Just fine. Go ahead.
My question for you is, the human body has a couple different parts that it's not used, and it's just kind of like your appendix and stuff like that. Do you think that maybe it's there from the creator for breathing apparatus in a different atmosphere or different earth? And I'll take my question off the air. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, since I'm not an anatomist, I probably shouldn't be saying anything here, but I'll venture into this territory. My short answer would be that I've never read anything about vestigial organs like that. I have done a little reading about vestigial organs, but nothing to that effect. I don't know how you would get a breathing apparatus out of your appendix. Maybe if it was connected to the lungs or something, you'd have some sort of argument there. But other than that, I'm not going to venture much further into anatomy.
All right. Let's see. You're on the air with Mike Heiser. Hello. Well, my control of this phone seems somewhat marginal. Hello there.
Hey, how you doing?
Okay, sir. Where are you?
I'm in Philly.
Philadelphia. Okay.
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
Philadelphia.
Okay, my question is, when I listen to you, with your theories and all your beliefs, biblical times and the Bible, it kills me that Black people have been just excluded from everything. And then your source, which you probably would admit, is mostly lies and deception and things that have been taken out and added to it. So where are you coming up with all this?
Well, I am really glad you called. Believe it or not, this is something I'm really interested in. How the Bible was used to justify really terrible views of racism. And again, for your listeners who are interested in this and for the caller, I would recommend getting a book called Adam's Ancestors. Okay, it's a scholarly book. It's dense, but you're going to love it because it shows essentially how this happened. And it's not an issue of what's in the Bible. It's an issue of how poorly thought about the Bible in the wake of, in the 1500s, discovering new peoples and other continents and discovering the new world. I agree with you. I think there's been horrific Bible interpretation that has been foisted on not just the Christian community, but on the African American community. That's just ridiculous and shameful, and it's abominable. The Bible itself doesn't teach a lot of what people say it teaches, and this is one of the best examples in the world.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from. My point is also, like you said, when the Bible was put together in the 14th and 15th century, they excluded Black people from almost everything. Well, everything. And when you do something like that, how can, now in the 21st century, a person like you could speak, with such authority about who the creator is and what took place during biblical times? I feel like you probably got a white Jesus hanging at your house. And until you get rid of that, how can you sit up here and talk about the creator? It kills me. When I hear white people talk about religion and I'm Black and they exclude my whole, everything. And they talk with such authority and I think almost arrogance, it just kills me.
Well, I don't have a white Jesus. I have a Middle Eastern Jesus because that is the context for Jesus. The Bible doesn't talk about white Europeans. It knows nothing of Nordic races or white European races or anything like that. So what you're attacking and what you're upset with, I agree with you. Okay, it's just really crappy Bible interpretation. I don't know how else to put it, but these kinds of ideas that you're reacting against have come basically because people handled the Bible really, really badly. Now, I'll correct you on one point. It wasn't put together in the 14th and 15th centuries. I was referring to the Reformation. That's a Christian tradition. It's nothing to do with when the Bible was produced. It's much older than that. But it's a Mediterranean-centered document. It's an ancient Near Eastern-centered document. You can say blacks are excluded. There's actually more African American material in the Bible than there is white European material. There's no white European material. It's a foreign world.
Michael, right there. Control of them now, I hope. On the air with Mike Heiser. Hello. Hello. Yes, hi.
Hi, Roswell. This is a very interesting subject that I think that everybody contemplates at some point. My question is, and it's changed to something that I've seen when I was younger. I've seen a creature that was obviously not human, but did contain and did possess obvious technology that was not introduced to us until much later years. But what
I want to know exactly. What you saw. Was this a humanoid type picture or what?
This was a humanoid lizard. I was 4 feet of it. I lived in the Midwest in the 1970s. We had no air conditioning units. You left your windows open in the summer times. Being a kid, the storm windows that you have, to keep the bugs out. Mine was busted out from basketball, so it was just basically an open window. I was sitting in bed. I've always been a very light sleeper. I found myself sitting up, and I was watching the back of a creature that was obviously lizard type creature. This creature, I was fascinated, but as a kid, I don't think being a kid, you get scared at just observing things. I was saying in fascination, this thing turned around and looked at me. I looked right at its eyes, and I didn't see eyes. What I seen were what looked like glass balls that had a red tinge around the very edge of it, such as you would see maybe at nighttime vision. That's hypothetical to me because I don't have that in my possession. Never had that in my possession. It's not evidence other than what I look back on and review it.
Okay, so you said you were a kid. How old were you?
I was 11 years old.
11 years old, and you were not asleep.
I was not asleep. Being up in my bed, observing this as it was going through the items that I had on my dresser. And when this thing turned around and looked at me, it probably looked at me for what seemed like a long time, but in reality was probably 2 to 3 seconds. Now, this is where people think that, and they laugh at me, that it's hokey pokey. This thing took its hand, which did have fingers. I don't recall how many fingers it had, and they weren't like dexterous fingers like human fingers, but it was actually like animal type fingers, and it touched a yellow belt that it was wearing, and I watched this thing disappear. Okay, now I don't know how much time had passed, but I then regained a consciousness. My closet door was open, and this same creature was rummaging around in my closet. I was still not panicked because it was moving slow. This thing did turn, and observe me. It was observing my condition of me observing it. Once it observed that I had seen it again, this thing moved so fast that it was like a strobe light, and it leaped right out that open window. And that's when I panicked. As a kid, I panicked when it moved fast. When it did move fast, I was able to observe it with fascination. I then screamed, ran to my parents' room. My parents came, opened, turned on the light, looked around. My closet door was obviously open, things had been strewn out of it, and whatever. I slept in my parents' room. They didn't believe me. The next morning, I checked on everything that I could find, that might be disturbed in my room. Earlier that day, in the 1970s, the elderly people that lived next door to me, they had a yard sale, and I bought a huge Rand McNally dictionary for $1. That's the only thing I could find that was missing from my room. Besides, there was a mess that I hadn't made.
All right. What do you think you encountered? Do you think you encountered something demonic or something alien?
No, I don't think I encountered something demonic, and I don't necessarily think I experienced anything that was extraterrestrial, because I didn't see any kind of a flying object or anything, but I did see.
Okay, what do you think you did encounter?
I think I encountered that some sort of secretive subculture that had technology that observed or was trying to learn more about us and gathering information. And here's what happened. The very next night, I waited for this thing. I sat up all night waiting for this thing to come through my window with a baseball bat. I know it sounds crazy.
We're short on time here, so did it come here or not?
No, but the third night, I was getting a drink of Kool-Aid, and I seen my mother had a plant that had toothpicks in it. It was sitting in the windowsill in the kitchen. I was drinking Kool-Aid, and I seen the hand come up and lift that thing up out of that. And I looked out, I peeked out, and I got scared because of the previous experience.
Yes.
And I see this thing, packing this thing into a cardboard box. This thing that picked that cardboard box up, looked at me now for the second time that it's seen me. Our garage was detached. This thing took about 4 steps and leaped up on the top of our garage and walked off towards the back where I couldn't see it. I couldn't wait until the next morning to get out there and climb up on top of the garage to see if there was some sort of fort, a nest, or anything. There was no evidence. There was nothing.
Okay, well, it sounds to me like you drank the Kool-Aid, right? Well, I know, but people have these encounters.
Absolutely.
He described a creature that was lizard-like. In what category, pray tell?
Well, the not shocking answer is I don't know what the guy saw. I could take up the time and go through the 4 or 5 different categories of people who study abduction research and the so-called old hag and the night terrors and all this stuff, and come up with categories that this go into. But ultimately, I don't know what the guy saw.
Like, is there possibly allowed for the English?
Yeah, I believe in a non-materialist. I'm a theist. I'm not a materialist. I believe in the so-called, for lack of a better term, spiritual world. Non-human intelligences that are disembodied and all that kind of stuff. I'm going to say something. This might be a little controversial here.
In what you believe and demand evidence for versus what you say to okay, go ahead.
If this happened to somebody that I knew personally, we had a good relationship, the first thing I would want to know was, are you living near a military installation, or do you have near relatives in the military? Now, the reason it's controversial is, as I will confess, I have been influenced by the work of people like Leah Haley, who believe a lot of this stuff, the whole MyLab thing. For somebody like her who was deeply entrenched in abduction research and this sort of stuff, for her to take the position she does now and for the reason she does, that would be really, really, really on the forefront of my mind. If this happened to me or somebody that I really knew. Ultimately, the honest answer is I don't really know what the guy saw. I think there could be interdimensional realities, spiritual realities, and all the vocabulary we have to use for this non-material world. Again, I'm not a materialist, so I believe these things could exist, but if you're going to put it in the extraterrestrial category, I'd like to first know that there are, such biological entities as opposed to, some other description, non-biological description.
Okay. All right. Let's see. You are on the air with Mike Heiser. Hello.
Hello, Art.
Yes.
Hey, Roswell, first time caller.
Hey.
I'm just select from Northern Michigan right now. I just wanted to ask your guest what his ideas, his thoughts are on other dimensions, higher dimensions, and which is something that really cannot be proved, actually. And if he does believe in a God, does he or does he not believe if it's like a multi-dimensional being, which in itself means that it cannot be proved?
All right, let's start with the dimensions. Theoretical physics right now thinks there may be 11. What do you think?
I don't see any reason to deny that there would be, more than all these dimensions. I mean, the caller's right. I mean, you can't necessarily prove these things. Again, there are postulates and there are ways you can sort of attack the problem that make it more or less coherent. But I mean, I don't see anything problematic about it. I mean, who ultimately knows? If there is a God, that God, that deity, could by definition exist outside our time and space and intrude upon our time and space, come and go, all that sort of thing. I don't have any problem with those suggestions by the world of physics and theoretical physics.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, you're very welcome. Or God could exist across all of those dimensions.
Sure. We just don't know.
Okay, first time. You're on here, Mike Heiser. Hello. Phone number maybe.
Hello?
Hi.
Hi. My question. Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry. My question is and kudos, Roswell, and hello, Mike. This doesn't go on in the Middle East. Does that mean that Christianity, Muslim fighting a moot point? And the Bible really doesn't matter much other than a directional? And my other, in addition to that, do you think that we
Hold on to answer that question. I want to try and get it straight. Mike?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the caller's asking either.
Right, okay. The thing is, what are you asking about the Middle East?
Well, with the Muslims and all their fighting, and they're saying that they have to beat the Christians and this, does it really, I mean, where does that fall into theology and the God image and the whole ball of wax? Is that a moot point? Is it useless? I mean, is it just something that they can do extreme for no reason?
I'm sure I'll get what I need still.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. I'm not quite sure either. If the question is all this stuff in the Middle East now about Bible prophecy, I'm one that would say no. I don't really see a real one-to-one connection there. If it's something bigger than that, there's fighting and there's wars, and I mean, Jesus did talk about that it's just going to go on and on and on. Well, then there's that connection, but I'm not quite sure what she's asking beyond that.
Yeah, it's more or less in that ball right there, what you had just said, the answer. My other thing was to do with creation. Do you think that with our higher intellect that is basically I mean, not to be rude, but you can take a redneck and try to explain something to them, and they're not getting it. Whereas you can take a scholar, and it's the most simplest thing to them. Do you think that our intellect allows us to see these other dimensions and things that other people wouldn't comprehend?
Yeah, I don't see how someone's grasp of this or that piece of content, in other words, their intelligence, I don't see any correlation to that being some sort of gateway to, seeing other dimensions. So I guess that's the best way I can answer that.
Okay, very good. You are on the air with Mike Heiser. Now you're on the air, I think. Hello.
Hey, this is Dante.
Hi there.
I had a question about the UFOs. Well, 1/3 of the angels fell with safety.
could the UFOs be manifestations of the angels? Because they're not leaving sonic boom, they're not leaving vapor trails or anything. So could it be just the manifestation that they have projecting onto us as a way to steal it from God? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm just waiting to see if you were done.
Oh, yeah.
This will open up a can of worms here. First, I don't actually believe that there's any passage in the Bible that says 1/3 of the angels fell with Satan. That comes from Revelation 12. But the comment about the third of the stars is actually in connection with the first coming of Jesus. So it's not. The whole idea of an angelic rebellion, as far as the Bible goes, I think is something of a myth. So you can tell I'll get some good email out of that one. I mean, I do believe that there are angels and demons and all this kind of stuff. I just don't believe that particular thing. But let's just set that to the side. The whole thing about UFOs and angels, to me, when we talk about UFOs, we're talking about craft. About entities that are humanoid. Angels in the Bible are always depicted in human appearance, which is quite different than these craft. They don't need craft. Again, it's an interdimensional reality. You don't need nuts and bolts technology to carry you from one place to another. If you command interdimensional passage, you don't need to get into anything. It's going to burn fuel to get you there.
All right. Let's see. You're on the air with Mike Hauser. Hello. Hi.
Got me?
I got you.
Hey, this is Billy. How y'all doing today?
All right.
Good. I got a couple questions. I got a point to make. And first of all, you've read that we're all over the page here. First we got a creator, which is the Lord, right? Okay. So you need a biological point. Well, let's just say here, if a alien kidnapped us is not taken as, he would need a biological point too. Everything is molecular. It's made up by molecular. If you have a creator, the creator made the molecular for it. You know what I'm saying?
Okay, Mike, this is your Mike is you're really in a zone.
Okay.
Okay, there you go. Go ahead, Mike.
I just wanted to do is
Can I go back? Raise my two point, and then I'll leave you alone here. Okay, with the African American that was talking earlier. Now, if you read the Bible, then when they had Cain and Abel, and Cain killed Abel, right? Okay. The Lord came to Cain and he put a mark on his body, and he said that he will be recognized now on this mark. Now, did you believe that's where black people came from? But also, when he sent them out in different tribes, remember when he had the land of Babel, okay? He sent them all out in different tribes. Now, that's how we get separation of race, not racist, racist.
Hey, can I interject there?
Sure.
Okay. No, I don't believe that the Cain and Abel story has anything to do with black people, okay, with the African American race or the Negro race. There are no physical characteristics attached to any of the tribes or nations in the table of nations in Genesis 10. Up until the 20th century, okay, late 19th century, let's be generous here, the race was defined in terms of language and religion. And that's the way it always was in the Bible. You defined a person's race by what language they spoke and what God they worshiped. That was separated. Okay, those things were severed to make a biological argument by, believe it or not, the Nazis, okay, early Nazi thinking, because of their wish to identify a particular biological set of characteristics with what they perceive to be an original race. So again, the Bible doesn't reason that way because they didn't know anything about science. They're not doing biology. Nowadays we need to go by genetic lineage and differentiation. We're more sophisticated than they were in the 19th century, and certainly in real primitive times, the second millennium BC or something like that. So I think a lot of this racial theory, this racial talk that people try to attach to the Bible, like I told the African American caller, is really misguided. And it's really contrary to the biblical world.
Yes. Well, but when they split them up into the different tribes, whatever the Moses walked around and put them all up different tribes,